Work, wealth, wisdom. This is DC Entrepreneur. We're sharing stories, ideas, and lessons from startups and businesses in the pursuit of innovation. And we're helping build a community of problem solvers and thought leaders in the Washington area. Now, here's your host, George Mocharko.
This is George Mocharko, host of DC Entrepreneur, here on WERA 96.7 FM. We're back with our third season, bringing you more great conversations with leading innovators and entrepreneurs from the Washington, D.C. area and beyond. Today, I'm speaking with Gbenga Ogunjimi. Gbenga is an identity strategist, speaker, and advisor who has coached hundreds of businesses and nonprofit leaders, such as Verizon, Airbnb, American Express, Teach for America, Susan G. Cohen, and the UN Foundation. Thanks for being here today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Tell me about your new book, Borderless Voice. You mentioned in the introductory story of the book that you had this really interesting path to becoming an international entrepreneur. And it starts with whenever you were here coming into the country. Tell our listeners what the story is and how you became and reinvented yourself as an international entrepreneur.
Borderless Voice, the power of telling your story and defining your identity, came up as a result of my coaching practice and coaching people through telling their story. And the book is about ordinary people who, by giving themselves permissions, became extraordinary catalysts for change in their communities. And one of those stories happened to be mine. It was a defining moment that happened to me in the city of Atlanta. Prior to that event, I'd been in the United States for a little bit about 2 years as an international exchange visitor with the State Department program, a program called Articulation for nonprofit leaders. So my professional identity was a social entrepreneur. Now, this time getting back into the country, I had to answer a question, and the question was, who am I becoming? Am I still becoming an exchange visitor, a volunteer, a social entrepreneur? So when I came into the country, which is typical, you go through customs and immigration, and was asked for my passport, and I did, presented it to them, and, asked to start the mission while I was coming back to the United States. And I decided to define myself as an international entrepreneur. And I told them that I'm coming back to the country to continue to start my business. At that moment, all heaven broke loose at that point. I was put in for secondary screening, and first they said, well, not going to allow me back into the country. I should not be doing a business. I should not be working. I am not a permanent resident. But for me, that was the best identity that resonated. So I said I was an international entrepreneur. It was an ordeal, and after a couple of hours, they came back and said, we're verified. We can tell that it's true what you said you're doing, but we want you to switch to a permanent residence. This is how you go about it. And that encounter was defining. It was a defining moment because I had the opportunity to alter my professional identity. In doing so, I created this brand for myself, and it became the cornerstone for my coaching practice and even the book. People who, at the borders, decisions, turning points of their life, decided to give themselves permission and alter their identity. To do so, they changed who they were, and because they did evolve, the environment started seeing them that way. So that is what that incident or event was all about.
So talk to me about that. So did you have a business set up already? Did you have the paperwork for the business? Or was it just in that moment you decided, no, I want to be in this country as an entrepreneur and focus on my consulting business?
Yes, I did. I'd already incorporated, I already had a business in operation. And coming into the country for my fellowship program, I've always decided that I was going to use this opportunity to expand my impact internationally. So that was always been the overarching vision and goal. So coming into it, I'd already started, I was a consulting firm, it's a pro bono consulting firm. So we send volunteers who are professionals from corporate America to startups in African organizations and internationally. So that was already ongoing, and we already have people in the field serving. We have a small operation in Washington, D.C. area. We had just started to expand the program to make it a two-way, having professionals and entrepreneurs come into the United States and vice versa. The whole vision was to bring diversity to the direction of service. So think about the Peace Corps and America Vista Corps program. So that was already ongoing. However, my legal status hasn't changed. And I was only limited. I had a timeline which is very limited when I was first in the country, but I continued the operation, which was at this point now international. But U.S. was still the base, so I was frequently the U.S. quite often. That was that encounter that happened, and I tried to explain that the process is already ongoing, and I needed to be back in this business.
We often hear the term social entrepreneur. There's a lot of different definitions for what it is. What does social entrepreneurship mean to you?
In the book, I talked about the defining moment I had with my very first coach and mentor then. So I just out of the university, and I was seeking a career path. I was entrepreneurial, but just being financially driven and motivated is not who I am or was. And just doing nonprofit work just to keep the lights on and just pursuing grants and donations is not that even resonate either. So I went to this coach and said, this is this crossroads that I am. And she said to me, if you want to make money and if you want to help people, you are a social entrepreneur. I've never heard the word social entrepreneurship at that particular time. It was interesting that 6 months after that conversation, Microsoft Corporation had this program called the Global Young Social Entrepreneurs Competition. It was a global business plan competition. I applied for that program. I was successful, traveled around the world, and shortly I came to the United States. Social entrepreneur for me was this idea of creating change, but using a business approach as an entrepreneur, as a business. But your overarching motivation is change making, not profit making. Profit is the conduit to get to the change. And that conversation helped put it in perspective for me. And then it was something I saw that. And for me, it was even beyond just having a business. It was almost like a calling. It was a vocation. It was something I thought it was meaningful work. I'm making change. And I'm also a businessman at the same time.
Yeah, I like that. So I think the most important takeaway there is that you mentioned it's not just about financially being prosperous in your entrepreneurship endeavors. It's about helping other people. And I think that's really the goal for any kind of business startup or any business owner is how can they help someone else? That's kind of the core way of how we define value. So talk to me about this new kind of initiative that you've been working on, this book called Borderless Voice. So tell me about the process of becoming an author and your issue expertise, which is identity management.
So prior to this book, I was a contributor for the Huffington Post. And several leaders in the field, contribute to one magazine or platform or the other. And it was an avenue where I tell the stories of people who go through coaching practice. When I saw the stories, it was an opportunity for me to think about how do I amplify the stories I've been telling on these platforms. And, the opportunity, I think the timing was right to write the book. If I would say the main catalyst for bringing this, I think it just happened when myself, giving my own self permission as well to stretch beyond. Because when it comes to identity, you can preface it with this question of who are you becoming? And who am I becoming? The question then was become an author. An author it sounds easy now, but it was a lot of stretch for me because I've never written a book before. And it was this new frontier I'm here to conquer. So that was my process of giving myself permission to say, you know what, it is time to amplify these stories. And that led to the book Borderless Voice.
So you've mentioned this word several times now, permission. It's an interesting concept because I think when it comes to entrepreneurship, there are a lot of people that are probably ready to start a business or ready to start a project, but they feel like they don't have permission from, if it's authority or someone to kind of just tap them on the shoulder and say, hey, go ahead and go for it. Tell me about that. Do you feel like there was a period in your life where you needed to have permission, or did you feel like the actual way of growing your career was to give yourself permission?
Well, I think it's something that a lot of people struggle with. And this idea that leaders in transition, they really struggle with this idea of defining their own professional identity. So if you think about that this way, you are the governing authority over your personal identity, your gender identity, your spiritual identity, your cultural identity. You do not need any permission to validate who you are in those respects. But when it comes to professional, though, oftentimes we look external to ourselves, whether it's to a community, whether it's to an industry, an employer, to validate who we are professional-wise. So really my goal is to challenge people with that thought process and say, no, the same way you are able to define your identity in all those respects, you have to be the agency to do that for yourself. And you don't need any external permission or validation for that. And that speaks to every one of us who have this aspirational goal of industry and thought leadership. So when I ask people that, think about the industry leaders in your field. Do you think there are certain things that you probably can do as much, or if not even better than they are? They said, absolutely. And the people you see on the television who write this magazine, who have been called to weigh in on industry issues, some of us have the same expertise, experience, sometimes even better. But the only distinction is someone decided, I am a thought leader. And the other person is still waiting, and someone is going to make me or give me permission to be a thought leader. So when you take that mindset shift and say, and apply it to yourself, now you start seeing acceleration.
Now you talk about your work as an identity strategist. It's not a term that I'm familiar with. Can you just help clarify what it is exactly that you do as an identity strategist?
Absolutely. So I start by asking this question of who are you becoming? That question comes with a great deal of vulnerability, and say, this is an aspirational goal. This is one life purpose or mission that I want to commit myself into. Now, it's something that it continues to be aspirational and becomes challenging for you to say, how do I manifest this identity? And in doing that, you have to tell your story and define your identity, you doing that all by yourself. In doing so, it was my job is having these exchanges and inspiring people to say, you know what, you would have to tell your story, you would have to define your identity. And what that simply means is to manifest this aspirational goal of one day I'm going to write a book, I'm going to be an entrepreneur, I'm going to run for public office. Now, collapsing that transition from that aspiration to your point of reality is the strategy for that is what my work is as an identity strategist. And the expression of that is the way people now tell a story and define a personal brand. And putting that together is what I do hand in hand, being an advisor to the clients, whether it is organization or whether it's an individual or a group, to say, we have this aspirational goal. How can we collapse the distance as fast as possible and manifest that? And that becomes our reality.
So it sounds like, to me, there's this decision that has to take place for future-based career goals. That has to be a shift in the mind before somebody can actually allow themselves to see them in that new role. Talk to me about that. Like, how do people visualize where they want to go in their career when maybe they don't necessarily see a common theme or thread running throughout their professional narrative?
I can definitely relate to that and the community that I serve. And the way I say that is this, that especially the multi-talented are the most conflicted because they have a ton of opportunities. The burden to make a decision becomes overwhelming, whether it is a career decision, whether it is a business decision, or say pursue a path that provides them meaning or purpose. That becomes challenging. So it comes to finding clarity. So once clarity has been accomplished, then we can come into storytelling. And the second point for that is articulation. If you look at my story, I had this aspirational goal of making change in the world. I never knew the pathway to that. It's called social entrepreneurship, or I have to manifest this identity called a social entrepreneur. That conversation gave me articulation for that. And once you do clarity, articulation, it comes to monetization. And the monetization is where you expand your sphere of impact, your sphere of influence, and your sphere of income. So that is the process in which it comes down to clarity, and then you can elevate the impact that you're trying to make.
So the name of the book is Borderless Voice. Tell me what a borderless voice is.
So I define borderless voice by starting with definition of a voice. That the voice is the manifestation of your life's purpose. And a borderless voice happens when these manifestations of your purpose, whether it's a business, a story, a 501c3, an enterprise, a campaign, becomes completely unencumbered by any obstacle. So think about it, whether you are trying to cross into a new field, a career, maybe from nonprofit to for-profit. You're trying to live in a new country. You're trying to go into public service. You're trying to create a change in your community. You are trying to change your professional identity. And now, when you are able to express that without any barriers, you found your borderless voice. Finding your borderless voice is really what the title is, the power of telling your story. You would have to come into terms with this idea that everyone has a story to tell. And once you tell that story, what happens is you activate a community, you activate your tribe. And in that tribe, that is where the magic happens. That is where the resources are. That is where the tools are. Oftentimes, people are trying to express a voice in community that is not a tribe. And there's all this opposition that comes to find alignment because the values are not shared. So once you come from the place of authenticity to tell your story, you activate. And I intentionally use the word activate because the community has always been there all along. When you tell that story, you now reveal that community, uncover that. And as a collaboration, as a community, you can now advance change. So there are several stories in the book. One of the stories, a woman by the name of Sandra. Now, Sandra came to Washington, D.C. from Boston, and a family came to America from Cape Verde. And Cape Verde is an island in West Africa. And they came in 1800s. So when they came to New England area in Boston, their professional identity was sewing. And but as an immigrant, quote unquote, that comes with its own stigma. So when she became an American, she did everything she could to distance herself from that stigma, if you would. So she went in a contrary direction. She pursued psychology. And she was doing well. She became a case officer helping people with facilities and transitional living. And ultimately, she said, I have to find my borderless voice. So she came to Washington, D.C., where our path crossed. In our coaching session, I asked the question, who are you becoming? And it became a vulnerable question for her, and she had to stop that conversation.
Why? What happened?
Well, because I was touching on something very personal to her, because I triggered, this idea of our family heritage and the stigma they had to deal with as the people kept coming up. And that was why she altered her professional path to psychology, kept moving to other cities because she was trying to distance herself from that reality. So when I keep asking that, she couldn't continue that conversation. And at a particular point, I think a couple of days, she texted me the word, the fashion psychologist.
The fashion psychologist?
The fashion psychologist.
Okay.
And I said, this is interesting.
I've never heard that term before. It's not a title that you come across, right?
Likewise, I've never heard it before that time. Let us talk about this. So she told me that she is finally giving herself permission to marry a family's heritage to a professional calling. Now, expertise was in psychology, as family identity, quote unquote, was in fashion, was in style, because that is what all ancestors did in America, coming to America. So the next goal was we put together a mission statement. And that mission statement was helping women combine the power of their wardrobe and mind to actualize the outcomes they are seeking in life. So you have two signature programs. One is the Holistic Fashionistas, and the other one is Sweat the Runway. And she is doing very well. She had her own program. She has her own brand. She has her own community. And I say this story because when we were doing the launch of a brand, a woman walked up to her, and she should be in her 60s or so. And she said, "Thank you, Sandra, because this is a struggle for most women. And thank you for showing up and being the lead and helping us with this." I say that because Sandra always had a community all along. But her greatest strength and power happens to be identity, her family identity, that she didn't want to do anything about. The moment she embraced that, she accelerated her journey to thought leadership and pulled down all the barriers that she had always confronted. Borderless voice, the greatest barrier of all is our own mindset, is our own paradigm. So there's an entire chapter there dedicated to paradigm shift. The moment you alter your paradigm, now you manifest this new identity. Your identity is the way you see yourself. Your brand is the way you see me. And then you create this new persona of who you are. And that is where your voice becomes borderless. And at that point, you make all the change that you envisioned making that was always been aspirational and now becomes a reality.
Now, we haven't focused on your work as a coach and consultant for Go Global. I'd like to find out some of the other types of clients that you work with to help them find what their identity is through their work. Talk to me about your work with Go Global, how long you've been in business, and who you've helped out.
So I do tell your story workshops across the country, and those workshops also targeted at businesses and nonprofit organizations. So these are leaders that are in transition. I try to call them thought leaders in transitions. And the community that resonate with me the most of those who are successful professionally, but they are going from success to greatness. And the people with things like legacy, greatness, impact, thought leadership, industry leadership resonates with. So this process of finding clarity to say, this is my community, this is my tribe, and articulating what that message looks like. So those are the people I work with. So they are trying to, those three pillars we talked about, clarity, articulation, and monetization. So those are the people that I serve in my coaching practice. So in the book, I told the stories of several people who I've gone through. So Sandra is one of those people that I just mentioned. And they are not just people in one particular field. It pretty much cuts across. So a lot of people that I serve have gone through professionally, they've been at the height of their professional career, and they say, at this point, legacy is important to me. And even some people would have had a breadth of experience and then say, I want to funnel and channel this into something that is cohesive. I want to tell a cohesive story. So you will find those as well in the book. You will find those who are trying to even take their impact beyond their community internationally to overseas, like I did coming to the United States. People who could be American will say, how can I take this impact here overseas? Or people who come to the United States and say, how can I find my voice in America? And how can I establish my own personal brand? So it's a mix of these individuals that I really work with. The core niche, what I do is story. And what I tell people is that your story is your greatest asset. So whether it is you're trying to raise capital, you're trying to write a book, you're trying to get a dream job, you're trying to get into a new industry, there will always be people who would have way more advantages and resources and skills and expertise than you have. But your greatest value differentiator is the story that you have. Stories are like your fingerprints, like your DNA. You are the only one with your story. So that is why I said, once you come from the place of story, from authenticity, you come from the spirit. And at that point, you get to a level of transcendence, and nothing can really stop that impact you're trying to make. And you're coming from the place of authenticity. And that in itself breaks down barriers. So that is the mix of the people that I serve, helping them with this process of how to tell their story.
So Gbenga means elevate.
Yeah.
And that's what one of your goals is, to help elevate people's stories, elevate their game in doing business. I have to say, whenever I look at a startup company and I go to their website, one of the first things I do is I go to the About Us page or where it says our story on there, and I read that because that really gives me an idea of the background and where someone's coming from with their business. Talk to me about what you've learned becoming an international entrepreneur and an author. What have you learned through the process? And talk to me about kind of the journey that you've had becoming and redefining yourself as an international entrepreneur.
There's a very interesting article that came out in The Guardian in the UK. It came out around 2012 or so. Very interesting title. And that title says, how come white people are experts and the rest of us immigrant? And it's so funny because we just had this conversation in my coaching conversation saying, can you tell me why you identify as an immigrant? And oftentimes people come up with all these immigrant stories that have shaped who they've become. And I try to challenge that paradigm and say, okay, those might be real, but at the end of the day, you have what it takes to alter that and to manifest the identity that best resonates with you. So that was started to think about this idea of having a borderless voice and international impact. It's not hinged on what my environment is. It's not hinged on what barriers or opportunities are. I create, as an entrepreneur, my opportunities. I make my own environment become enabling and not the other way around. So my greatest asset in my journey and trajectory to entrepreneurship, particularly in America, is actually my international, my immigrant status, as if you were using that, because that gives me a unique voice and brand and say, this is my unique value addition, this is what I bring, to my community. And that has been my greatest strength. So in my coaching, I ask people is, how would you identify outside of your own country? And people use amazing words like, power of love, I'm a people person, those are nice. And professionally, though, how would you identify yourself? And I start to make them think about whatever community impact that you have. International identity is being able to expand that within an international context, and or within an international space. So if we can use this prefix, international, what would your identity sounds like? So I've never thought about it this way, but the default perception is I am an immigrant. And I thought that really helped to really redefine and think about that and say, no, I'm an international entrepreneur because you are coming here to add value and you're going to where you are to add value. So that is something I've learned in my own journey.
Yeah, it's just an official status, right? Mm-hmm. It doesn't define who you are as an individual. What's happening right now, and today particularly, with immigration has been something where the U.S. has to reevaluate itself, because when we think about the story that the U.S. tells, America is the land of opportunity. This is where we have people that want to come from all around the world to be in this country. And it seems like a lot of those opportunities are starting to go away now because it's become harder and harder to get into the country. And I think what's interesting about that is the fact that the U.S. for so long has had this kind of narrative that we are the land of opportunity, that you can come here and you can contribute and add value. We believe that that is the main narrative. Have you found anything counter to that narrative?
Well, I think that is the reality of a lot of people, particularly in this climate right now. And a lot of people really are going through evaluation of that narrative, if this really applies to them, and this is their own true story and their reality. And so those challenges manifest as what you would call obstacles for them to find their voice in this new country they call home. And my recommendation to anyone who struggle with that is we just have to go back to the basics. Like, this country has always been all about innovation. It's always been about tapping into something beyond what we know and redefining or really creating boxes for other countries to think about. And those who come to this country have always been visionary, and they created innovation that benefits not just their local community, but around the world. Whether it's America or UK or whatever they're going through, this redefinition of national and international identity. The responsibility is on the people there to really tap within themselves and come from the spirit and say, what unique value, what addition, what contribution am I making to this environment? And whatever country that is just a platform to make a more global impact. And that is what I'm seeing. So, as I said, I ask people is, how would you define yourself outside of your own country? If cultural heritage wasn't something that it's in question, what other label, what other identity would you choose to caption who you are? Then I tell people you just have to come from the spirit. You just have to come into your into this thing called authenticity and say, what am I bringing? What value am I adding to this particular environment? And that is certainly my story. When I came here with an exchange program. 50 of us came from around the world. And the first thing I realized was the Peace Corps. And it was an opportunity for Peace Corps volunteers to go overseas and make change. And what I asked myself was, how can we increase that diversity? How can we make it a two-way exchange? When I started to talk to communities that they might consider themselves as minority or immigrant, they didn't go to the Peace Corps program. And it was my call to action to do something about it. So I created a social enterprise. And that program was serving those communities, bringing more diversity to the Peace Corps program. That is what I think that every one of us will come here to elevate our permission-giving process to say, how can we elevate the impacts that we find in this country or the landscape and bring something unique of value to it? It's not just for the country, it's for the rest of the world. And while the U.S. might be the location for that impact to get started, it has a value that can really far exceed, your current environment. And we do have technology. We have tools within our disposal. We have social media. I do have clients and my coaching practice is relatively young. I do have clients from Australia and Dubai and around the world, because we all have access to these resources at our fingertip. So I think a lot of people are really talking about shadows and not the substance. And once you start coming from the substance, the value you can create, it's very limitless.
I think what's interesting too also is that almost everybody that lives in the U.S. has to have some kind of story of how they got there or their ancestors got here. I know my own personal story is, I had my grandfather on my mother's side. Him and my grandmother got married. They came from Italy. He came to this country. He was a builder. He helped build houses throughout Pennsylvania where they lived. And there's a shift that had to take place in that identity of, okay, he comes to this country, is he just somebody that comes to the country? No, what did he do? He helped people out by building houses. I think there's something to that. I with the exception of obviously indigenous peoples and, native tribes that have been here, everybody's got that story of their time coming to the U.S. When it comes to being here, do you feel like that's also kind of a product of Washington always having to talk about what you do? Because that's like the first question we ask people is, what do you do? Right? And sometimes it's a tough question. It's kind of intrusive because we do so many things, I'm not just a podcast host or a radio show host here. There's so many other roles that we have to play. How do you help people find one unifying link between these different roles that they are in their personal and private lives?
Oh, that's a great question. And so what I say is this, that you are not what you do. That what you do is an expression of who you are. And if you start to elevate that question to not just what you do, but who you are, and thinking about who you are, start speaking to your brand. And that gives you an opportunity to tell a cohesive story that captures many facets of your identity or your professional identity, which is not a monolith, which is not just one expression or one-dimensional. If you start thinking about this idea that I am a brand And that brand, it's a business. And that business have departments and products and marketing teams and have all these various facets to it. And whether it's me as a podcast host or as a walking my dog or as a great son or as a great employer, entrepreneur, this is just the expression for this enterprise, called your first and last name. And that begins to give you a whole new paradigm shift about who you are. Now, getting to that, my journey to that is tell people to find the core. As I said, when you're multi-talented and you have a lot of options, you become more even conflicted. The challenge is not really finding what should I do or what should I caption as my identity. The caption is finding the core, finding the point of commonalities to all this interest. So I have a simple test and challenge I give people. So Judge, were to take you away from Washington, D.C. and relocate you to, let's choose a country called Indonesia. You don't know anyone in this country. You don't even know their language. What is one skill you have that you can rely upon for your survival? So what is your survival skill or talent? That question start giving you the process of getting to your core. Now that core will be the basis that you now architect your personal brand. Now, all the various interests that you have, the process start becoming cohesive, and you start telling a cohesive story. And those interests can shift, can change over time. Talking about myself, we've gone from me being a social entrepreneur to become an international entrepreneur, to become a life coach, an identity strategist, and now to become an author. So the outlets for my impact keep changing, but I see my core as someone on this mission to elevate. And to elevate leaders to their greatest levels of impact. So when I'm doing that, and the roles I do that can change, but what is the brand that captions this, my perception outside of myself? That is how you go about telling your story. And also when it comes about telling your story, I tell people that your story is not your past to date. It is your proximity to your dream. It is where you're going. So the first challenge is find the core. What is your survival skills and talent? The second challenge is who are you becoming? What is that aspirational goal? That somewhere in between start getting you to think about what is my strongest values, those things that I really value. And once you start shifting conversation to why, and you start tapping into value, now you start speaking about your personal brand. At that point, the opportunities for impact are limitless, because even almost like these opportunities that are coming to you, as an entrepreneur, think about it like working on your business versus working in your business. Personal brand is when you start working on your business. You have this panoramic 360 perspective, and then you can harness all this expression and interest, multiple interests that you have.
Work is an expression of what you do, not who you are. Yeah. I think that's what is kind of the fallacy that we do here in Washington, is that we think we are our job title. We think we are, an entrepreneur, or we think we are a business leader, but those are just expressions of what we happen to be passionate about or want to focus on. What about people that feel like they're being defined unfairly by what they are? Say for instance, you have somebody that is a multi-talented person, but maybe their job title is kind of lowly in status or stature. How do you help those people kind of redefine their narrative whenever they talk about themselves to others?
My first recommendation is to take the responsibility of the people defining them unfairly and assume that responsibility completely and say, I have the responsibility to tell my own story and define my identity, which is all the book is all about. Oftentimes we do what is called reflected identity. Someone think we are this and then say, oh, that is who I am. Someone say you are this and oh, that's who I am. No, it is your responsibility. Again, let us start thinking about your own self-perception. How do you see yourself? That is a great starting point. Not so much of what the industry, country, not so much of none of that. Let's start with that. Now, the second, do you really believe that? That does resonate with you? Now, once you become integral with that, what happened is your story would change. The expression, the vocabulary you used to tell your story would start changing. So there's this chapter in the book called The Power of Language. And I talk about people who have been identifying or expressing themselves one particular way. But the moment when that vocabulary change and they start using different words to define who they are, they literally saw their own environment start to change. But again, it always starts and ends with you taking responsibility to say, this is the way I see myself, and I'm going to tell the story. And now we have a ton of outlets to do that now. We have social media. We have this podcast. We have limitless opportunity for us to project a brand. But oftentimes we don't have that crystal clarity as to this is what I want my brand or message to be all about. So a lot of people are this and that today and this tomorrow, and someone said this, someone said that. That is not even important at this point. Let us get to start. So let me put it in more context. So I was in New York. I was actually on Wall Street, George. Imagine this. And I was speaking to, think about it, all these wealth managers and investors in this room. And they gave me the opportunity to talk about storytelling. And I start the conversation by asking, who here in the room would regard themselves as a thought leader? And I thought I saw one hand going up and down. And then I said, what about an industry leader? Maybe one or two people in the room. And I said, okay, let's unpack that for a moment. This is the financial district of the world. And why would people of this caliber would not even, because oftentimes we think this struggle, it's personal. We don't realize it's universal. Like, why would people struggle to say this is who they are? And then it was this philanthropy organization. And someone said that, and then I said, do you know that it is your responsibility to determine if you're a thought leader or not? And someone said, did you know that I've been doing this for 20 years and no one ever said to me, I can identify as a thought leader in this particular field? Research has said 10,000, 1,000 hours. You've gone way beyond that to have mastery in anything. Now, the people will tell me the names of the people that you consider as thought leaders. Oh, they are on the radio, they're on the television, they have industry journals. But you know that you can literally do those things by yourself and you don't have to go to anyone. You can literally go to LinkedIn right now and start publishing your own That's
true.
And the old room said, what? I never thought about that. I am the one that have to define the identity. That by default, we look external and look to the second party to validate who we are. So this book is all about, no, we have to flip that process. We are the one we get to tell our own story and define our identity. Then we express a borderless voice.
Are there any thought leaders in particular that you feel are influential or who you've looked up to as either role models or people that have helped you get on this path?
Oh, there are several. There's several of them. Was in 2005. The World is Flat came up.
Thomas Friedman.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
That book was life-changing. And, his message is really that it's now a global connected world. The world is not spherical, it's flat at this point. That you can literally cross over, whether you're from Bangalore or from Boston, that, you can make an impact in the world. So I was trying to elevate that conversation because Borderless Voice, it's really a build off of The World is Flat in some respects because Thomas Friedman talked about the power of technology as the flatteners. And I'm talking about the power of your paradigm to be the ultimate equalizing flattener, that once you alter your paradigm and you start seeing your professional identity differently, then you can manifest this brand that you've always wanted to manifest. So Thomas Friedman would definitely be one of them. In the social impact space, Scott Beale, the founder and CEO of Atlas Core. It's a program that brings diversity as well to international service. My mentors and my coaches that I put the name also in the book. So these are people that I really have great admiration for. And finally, as a Nigerian woman who had this TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story, Chimamanda. Now she has the book Americana, and she's also a great voice, someone I would say been able to find and express a borderless voice. So those are the names that come to mind.
I'm looking here in your book, and one of the things you talk about is the hero's journey. I know hero's journey has been applied to storytelling like we get in Hollywood through fictional narratives. How can we apply our own story of the hero's journey to our mission, our goals, and telling about who we are?
To do that, I'm going to ask you to take inventory of the peak moments in your career and your life and process in which you have overcame certain obstacles or barriers, and telling that story from the point of an overcomer. Oftentimes when it comes to storytelling, unconsciously we get reactive rather than proactive. Thinking through and say, and again, I gave some case studies and stories in the book, and people are literally changed their definition or interpretation of what had happened to them, and being in control and being in the driver's seat and said, this is how I was able to use this event to get to where I am now. And that speaks to my leadership, and that speaks to my hero journey. So taking inventories of those peak moments when we overcame. Another is to take inventory of defining moments. So there's a whole chapter in the book about moments. And one of those moments, stories that I talked about in the book, if you even think about one of the American greatest business success stories, Starbucks, right? But Howard Schultz went to Italy and he found this coffee house that he had a visceral experience, and almost like he found. And he said every part of his being was like, this is it. And if you think about the story of Starbucks, you can think about that one defining moment that changed our day-to-day lives living in America. This idea of building community around coffee, and this third place, was what happened, was a particular event that happened, to this particular individual. I told the story of Susan G. Komen. Susan G. Komen happened with a tragedy, with a crisis moment. Nancy Jean Brinker promised a dying sister she would do everything within her power in a dying bed of cancer. And that became an organization that is in the north of $3 billion. And all they had was $200 and a few donor names.
When they started?
When they started.
Wow. And
now it's $3 billion. So all of this are specific timelines in our narrative. So oftentimes, take example, what happened to me at the airport. It just happened, and I just went over it as if it didn't happen. And I was telling someone, I said, that would make a good story of a book. And that opened me up. That was a defining moment. And when I start talking about serving people who might be international or trying to go overseas to expand their impact internationally, I can pinpoint that particular moment, and that establish a points of commonality. So telling that hero or shero journey is to take inventory of your peak moments, take inventory of your defining moments, and flip the journey and start approaching your story from being proactive and not reactive. And that is how you tell a journey, a leader's story, a story that is influential, ability to influence the other person.
Anything else you'd like to leave our listeners with?
You can go to YouTube and search Borderless Voice, the power of telling your story and defining your identity. And you can listen to the introductory chapter of the book on YouTube. But the action item I want to leave with this community is in telling their story. I think we all should go back and take inventory of our defining moments and our peak moments and write those down. You'll be amazed what is going to come out of that process.
So Gbenga, tell our listeners how they can get in touch with you.
My website is Gbenga.org. It is gbenga.org. And that website has my social media on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter and LinkedIn as well.
Great. Well, you've been hearing from Gbenga Ogunjimi, and he is the author of Borderless Voice, as well as the mind behind Go Global Incorporated. Thanks so much for joining us in the studio today, Gbenga.
Thank you for having me.
We'll catch you next time here on DC Entrepreneur.
Subscribe to this podcast via iTunes and connect with us on our blog, dcentrepreneur.com. If you have any tips or ideas for stories, please tweet at us or message us on Facebook. Please tune in to our next episode, and thanks for listening.